Good morning and welcome to First Jefferson Unitarian Universalist Church in Fort Worth, Texas. We've chosen not to provide in-service programs until we are sure that all dangers of the coronavirus pandemic are past. Instead, we are streaming our Sunday services on our Facebook page. My name is Annie Foerster and I'm minister of this congregation. Our pianist this morning is Misha Beresnev and our tech in training is Julie Hevelone. Guy Thornton and David Winkowski are also here to help with this process, and this morning I have a co-singer, Virginia Thornton. We hope that you and your families are keeping safe at home. Visit our webpage at firstjefferson.org if you want any more information, or if you would like to be put on our mailing list, email that is. We begin our morning worship with music. My reading this morning is from Mark Morrison Reed, a colleague of mine. He wrote, "The central task of the religious community is to unveil the bonds that bind us each to all. There is a connectedness, a relationship discovered amid the particulars of our own lives and the lives of others. Once felt, it inspires us to act for justice. In this church that assures us that we are not struggling for justice on our own, but as members of a larger community. The religious community is essential, for alone our vision is too narrow to see all that must be seen, and our strength is too limited to do all that must be done. Together, our vision widens and our strength is renewed." Please join me in singing our opening hymn this morning. It's number 40 if you have a hymn book at home. "The Morning Hangs a Signal." chalice lighting is on your screen. Please say it with me. We gather this hour. Wait, I haven't found my lighter yet. Help. I am without fire. But never fear. There will be a small technical delay unless someone can find another. Oh, I can't operate a cigarette lighter. I always burn my thumb. Here we go. Technical difficulties are happened even to the professionals, so here we go. We're going to light our chalice this morning with these words. We gather this hour as people of faith, with joys and sorrow, gifts and needs. We light this beacon of hope, song of our quest for truth and meaning in celebration of the life we share together. And now let us repeat our affirmation, the covenant that we repeat each Sunday morning. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest of truth is our sacrament, and service is our prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve others in community to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with creation. Thus do we covenant with one another. Since what we choose is what we are, and what we love it shall be, the goal may ever shine afar, the will to win it makes us free. A little report this morning. The Board of Trustees got a report from the Stewardship Chair, Patrick Gutierrez, last Sunday on the Spring Pledge Drive. Our drive is doing as well as can be expected under these trying conditions. We haven't yet heard how many people are temporarily removed from their jobs at this point, and we understand that many cannot make pledges like those they made this year. However, what we don't yet know is how many people who have their pledges automatically withdrawn from their checking accounts will continue to pledge at last year's rate. Traditionally, some people, if they intend to keep their pledge the same, don't fill out an annual pledge card, and it is difficult to count them until we ask. So if this relates to you, please let Patrick know that you're in and want to be counted. Easier still, send an email to Carl in the office at administrator@firstjefferson.org. That's administrator@firstjefferson.org. And we thank you. We'll let you know how the May congregational meeting will be run as soon as we figure it out ourselves. The board is working on it. Now is the time for the story for all ages, and I invite you to gather around to hear it. I have both a project for you and a story today. This is something you can do on any day, and you can do it more than once. All you have to do is ask yourself this question. If you could invite anyone you wanted, anyone, living or dead, to have lunch with you and to hang out for the afternoon, who would you choose? Would you choose your favorite singer, a sports hero, a movie star perhaps, someone you admire, or perhaps someone you didn't like so much so you could ask them, why on earth did you behave so badly when you were alive? I've played this game hundreds of times, and I often invite someone to an imaginary lunch and conversation that I've never talked to before. I often invite my favorite authors or poets, but sometimes I choose scientists because I like the way they think, keeping their minds open for new truths and possibilities. I had a fascinating lunch with Neil deGrasse Tyson recently. He's very smart, and he's very funny as well. Today, I thought I would have lunch with Francis David. Do you know who he is? He was a Unitarian minister in 1510. That's 520 years ago. He lived in Transylvania, and he was the founder of the Unitarian Church of Transylvania. Not just one church, but the entire Unitarian religion in the country. But he didn't start out that way. He grew up in the Catholic Church because it was about the only church around in those days. What we call the Reformation and the creation of the Protestant churches had started when he was about 7. That's when some people started saying, shouldn't we be able to follow our own religious thoughts? Shouldn't we be able to have our own church if we want it? So when Francis David was about 30, he was introduced to the Lutheran theology, and he became a Lutheran minister. Sometime later, he was made a bishop, which is a minister who's in charge of a whole lot of other ministers. But he kept thinking, and he kept trying to find a truth about religion that made sense to him. In 1557, the National Assembly of Transylvania made it a law that everybody should live in a belief that he or she wants if it is done without distrust of another. They invented religious freedom. This had never been done in any country before. David wrote an essay disputing the Catholic view of the Trinity because he believed that God was one, not 3 gods in one. And that's how Unitarians got their name, you know. Unit meaning one, Trinity meaning 3. Prince Sigismund, who later became King of Transylvania, made David the court bishop and made Unitarianism the state church, but he allowed other churches freedom to follow their own beliefs. Later, unfortunately, the country's laws were changed when a new king was anointed. People had to follow the religion of the new king. Francis David went to jail for preaching the Unitarian doctrine, and he died in prison, but he never gave up his beliefs. If I could invite him to lunch, I'd ask him what it was that made him so strong. How did he resist prison? And what made him believe the way he did? You know, he laid the foundations for the Unitarian churches we have today, and he is one of my heroes. I'll be interested in hearing who you invited to lunch today. Have a good time and a good conversation. This is the time in our service called Communion of Names and Milestones, when we share the stories that live in this community, the sadness and the happiness that we have in our lives. I haven't heard from anybody this week, but I do have a message from the Board of Trustees. They write, with the May congregational meeting approaching, the Board of Trustees is actively researching ways in which we can safely and effectively meet as a congregation. We hope to have more information on that soon, so please be on the lookout for more communications from the board. Thank you. So we'll assume that people are doing fairly well as can be expected until we hear otherwise. And do let us know how you are faring, what you're doing to keep busy, and if you're having any problems and need any help. In the meantime, we will just consider one another, think of one another, the friends and the acquaintances that we know are part of this community in which we keep in our hearts and our minds. Let us take a moment to share the silence as we consider this beloved community who we haven't seen for at least 6 weeks now. Take care and stay well, and we'll see you as soon as we can. Misha? Since I brought up Francis David during the Story for All Ages, I thought I would share with you some of the things he said in his writings, pieces of wisdom and philosophy that have come down to us through the ages. He said, "In this world there have always been many opinions about faith and salvation, but you don't have to think alike to love alike." He also said, "There must be knowledge in faith also. Sanctified reason is the lantern of all faith. Religious reform can never be all at once, but gradually, step by step. If they offer something better, I will gladly listen." I think he was a very smart man, don't you? And finally, he said, "The most important spiritual function is our conscience, the source of all spiritual joy and happiness. Conscience will not be quieted by anything less than truth and justice." Please join me in our hymn, Sing Out Praises for the Journey. Number 295, we'll sing verses 1 and 3. Well, today is an anniversary celebration. It is the 40th anniversary of the day that First Unitarian Church of Fort Worth and Jefferson Unitarian Church of Fort Worth merged and became First Jefferson Unitarian Universalist Church. Now, when I heard this, I had intended to have several people who might have been there at the merger or knew people who were speak from this pulpit, telling you in their own words of this momentous historic moment. But we will have to settle for asking them later what their thoughts were on that day. And so we'll celebrate again when we can get together. The church's journey started long before that, 34 years before that date of April 26, 1980. Next year, we will celebrate the 75th anniversary of the birth of this congregation, and I hope to tell you more about that journey as well. But today, I want to share with you some of what led up to the merger, why there were two churches to begin with, and how religious ideas change throughout the ages, throughout one single person's life, and how those changes must be met with open minds and open hearts if we are to continue as a strong religious presence in this community. When I first joined with you here at First Jefferson at the end of 2017 as an occasional preacher, I asked for any historical notes about the church, thinking I might understand you better if I knew what had taken place before I arrived. I was given a notebook titled Church History, Unitarian Universalists in Fort Worth, Texas, 1946 to 1993, written by Dorothy M. Greninger. The history itself was dated October 6, 1992. Dorothy Greninger was a member of this church, but I think she was not an historian. She was more of a storyteller. In fact, she starts out her history with these words: "Once upon a time, there was no Unitarian church in Fort Worth." But you know, that's my kind of history. I appreciate her efforts. Unfortunately, no one has recorded the history of the church from 1993 to today, and I'm hoping someone out there will take on that project before too long, before our stories are lost entirely. But I will save the early history for the next year at the 75th anniversary celebration. For now, I want to explore why there were 2 Unitarian churches in Fort Worth after there had been none at all, and why they merged instead of growing in different directions, as often happens in a large city like this. The first Unitarian church in Fort Worth was named simply the Unitarian Church of Fort Worth. The congregation grew slowly and then more rapidly, and in 1965, their dream was to have a home for 300 people to worship together. Unfortunately, that's also the year when the dream began to fall apart. I've decided not to use names in this retelling, mostly because I don't know the people or I don't recognize the names, and because for this telling, it really isn't important who might have been at fault or who might have been the hero in the conflict if there was one. I'm more interested in the reactions of the community, the people, for they are in reality the church, just as they are today. Dorothy Greninger was just one of those members, and she explained it like this. In the summer of 1965, a secret board meeting was held to attack the minister. His humor was biting, he was divisive and oversensitive, and some said he was not available and not social. He had told a member of the congregation he had received an unsigned letter threatening to expose him as a homosexual. Now, those are pretty amazing words. You can see how the history of ideas and social norms have changed over the years within the lifetime of many of us. To be threatened to be exposed as a homosexual was the end of a person's career in those days. And Greninger's words might just have showed which side of the controversy she was on, because boards don't have secret meetings. They have closed sessions when they need to discuss something sensitive, like a staff member's actions, especially if there is a split of support in the congregation. The goal of such a meeting is to stop the conflict, not fan the flames by airing it in public. The board did not attack the minister, nor did they fire him at that meeting. They hoped that differences might be worked out. While some of the congregation was intent on defending him, others were equally intent on getting rid of him. It's an unfortunate situation in a church, but it happens more often than we would like. He himself was aware of the controversy over him, whatever its causes, and he had already started to look for another position. There might have been some healing not mentioned in this written history, some optimism for going forward. In fact, at its next open meeting, the board actually voted to give the minister a raise. Those who thought he should leave were outraged. They wanted the whole board to be replaced. Greninger wrote, there was now a power struggle over who would be on the nominating committee. But apparently the struggle was not handled by Robert's rules, because Greninger's next statement is this: almost everyone on the board resigned. After much discussion, about a third of the congregation decided to leave and organize their own church, which they called Jefferson Unitarian Church. Their second choice for a name had been the Adlai Stevenson Unitarian Church. I think that's an interesting thing to note. That didn't happen. Their reason for leaving, they said, was that they wanted a church with a stronger school for children and youth and a feeling of extended family. To all outside appearances, the split was amicable. The original church changed its name to First Unitarian Church of Fort Worth, and the two churches went their separate ways. The minister at the center of the original controversy stayed on at First Church until 1974, but the congregation failed to recover the loss of that one-third of its members. It was in 1974 that it was first suggested that now that the minister was leaving, the two churches might get back together again. If that had been the only reason for their split, that would make sense. But like all passionate people, each group grew the story of why they had split. There was too much difference in the stories to heal any residual disagreement and to make that happen at that time. Jefferson Unitarian founders had intended that they be a lay-led fellowship from the beginning. A postcard had been sent to all members of the original First Church, inviting them to the initial meeting, and 50 people attended. These people decided that they wanted to be a church, not a fellowship, and informed the Unitarian Universalist Association in Boston of their intention. Within a month, they had committees in place, elected a board, began a pledge campaign, and had a sign-up of 50 charter members. All this within a month, wrote Greninger, was heady stuff. And the church was accepted into the Unitarian Universalist Association on September 21st, 1966. Their first goal was a building, but in the meantime they met, as Dorothy Greninger wrote, any old where, in banks, community rooms, in the YWCA. I like this next part of her story especially. She said, "These were fun-filled years, years of lugging our equipment home from the Y, watching the pigeons on the window ledges, trying to keep the church school children from upsetting the YWCA personnel, filling the coffee pot in the restroom, because how could Unitarians manage without their coffee hour? Trying to sort out visitors from those visiting the Y for other reasons, and simply loving it. Weren't we excited and proud, overachievers? We nearly worked ourselves to death." Well, nothing much has changed from that last statement, has it? Most people passionate about their church community are willing to work to make it succeed. I see it now every day in this child of the merger. In 1969, having grown from 50 members to about 68, with a high percentage in attendance every month or every week, Jefferson Church decided to participate in the new Unitarian Universalist Association Minister on Loan program. This allowed lay-led churches to experience a minister in residence for a period of up to 6 months or so as they prepared to call one of their own. In 1972, they were allowed into this program, and in 1973, they called their first minister, who stayed for 3 years. Their original goal had been to become a strong community, a kind of spiritual commune, they called it. But by the end of their first 10 years, Greninger reports that the church no longer had one central entity. Instead, she wrote, there was a cluster of new entities, each rotating on its own axis. She also reported that First Church had developed this same kind of planetary existence. Neither group had learned to compromise or combine their ideas into a single mission or vision. In the meantime, both Jefferson and First Church received extension ministers, the latest program of the UUA, to grow fellowships into full-time churches, with some financial support for the salaries from headquarters. Neither church became a congregation that could manage to support a full-time minister. Jefferson Church, in fact, was discussing disbanding. The idea of merger was introduced again. Talks began and continued until there was a resolution. Greninger wrote, "Eventually, as you know, we did merge." Now, I'm assuming some adjustments had to be made by both communities in order to become one church again. This is Greninger's take on it. "We started originally as a band of intellectuals with interest in a full church program. Today, the church is much less intellectual than it was in our days." Realistically, she might have been correct, but not because there were fewer intellectual minds in that congregation. This was a statement that could have been made anywhere in the country. The face of Unitarian Universalism was changing with the changes in society. I remember when I joined my first Unitarian church in 1958, the sermons were indeed very intellectual, mostly historic in nature and much supported by eloquent quotes from earlier theologians. It was in the mid-'80s, coincidentally when more women were becoming Unitarian ministers, that sermons began to take on a tone of storytelling, including not just ideas, but feelings, dreams, hopes for the future. Not everyone appreciated this change in social attitude. I remember one member of my own church in the mid-'90s expressing it this way: "They have taken away my religion and given me something else, something about spirituality of which I know nothing," he lamented. Changing social norms outside an individual church or denomination always has an effect on the church itself. Think of all the historic things that took place in the late 20th century. The civil rights movement, the women's movement, the gay movement, movements unnamed but affecting everyone's changing attitudes. I think it is the strength of the Unitarian Universalist denomination and its individual congregations that we have absorbed those movements into our own churches, changed our thinking slowly but surely, and accepted people we once turned away. No one, for instance, would consider today threatening a minister by exposing him as a homosexual. We're all part of one family, no matter our origins, our beliefs, our ethnicity, the color of our skin, or whether we see the glass half full or half empty. And that is the value that is expressed in today's Unitarian Universalist congregations, not this church alone. This is our strength. This strength is woven throughout our individual histories, our congregational histories, and our denominational history. In 1980, when this particular church history was written, the newly joined congregation had 229 members. Ministers have come and gone since then. Social norms have changed, people have adapted, and the same is true of the church's goals and visions. Religious ideas throughout the history of the world have come and gone, changed and changed again. Think of Francis David, who I introduced in the Story for All Ages. He was a Catholic priest, then a Lutheran bishop, and finally the founder of Unitarianism, which became for a brief moment his country's official religion. And then he found himself in prison for those very same beliefs. People get angry when their ideas are rejected. Controversies do arise. But mostly I think we eventually come to our senses and find goodness in one another and in our diverse opinions. It is in our favor that Unitarian Universalism supports the theology of unity in diversity. This is the message I take away from our celebration of the merger 40 years ago. It is sad that there had to be a falling apart, friends in disagreement, anger over decisions made. But in the end, there is the joy of knowing that disagreements were forgotten and forgiven, and that we continue this celebration of 40 years by maintaining the names of both congregations in our name today. First Jefferson Unitarian Universalist Church holds the memory of all those who came before us, the giants on whose shoulders we stand, even as we admit they had clay feet, that they were human, as we are. We have no idea how we will be when we come together once more as a community, how this corona crisis will affect our next few months or years. Will we thrive, or will we falter because of it? Will we come into one another's presence again with love and longing, or will we have gone in different directions during our isolation? I don't know. But I do know that we are a community of faith and love and hope. I know that wherever the future takes us, we will continue to work hard to support it, to make it better, to be more inclusive, more supportive of justice, and more open to what the future has yet to teach us. I remembered there are words in our hymn book written by the Reverend Rob Eller Isaacs that kind of speaks to this message for me, and I would like to say them as a responsive reading, and I will give you your part of the reading in a moment. For remaining silent when a single voice would have made a difference, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. That last is your part. Say it with me. We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For each time that our fears have made us rigid and inaccessible, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For each time we have struck out in anger without just cause, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For each time that our greed has blinded us to the needs of others, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For falling short of the admonitions of the Spirit, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For losing sight of our unity, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For those and for so many acts, both evident and subtle, which have fueled the illusions of separateness, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. Happy anniversary, First Jefferson. Let us go forward in faith from this point on. Please join me in singing our closing hymn, Forward Through the Ages, number 114 in the hymn book. Let's sing all 3 verses. Extinguish our chalice that has burned as a symbol of this community, reminding ourselves that not alone we conquer, nor not alone we fall. In each loss or triumph, lose or triumph all, let us go forward from this day forward in the strength that is our community. Unto the Church Universal, which is the depository of all ancient wisdom and the school of all modern thought, we pledge the allegiance of our hands and our hearts. So may it be in all our lives.